Could you have imagined that behind the glittering facades of the palaces of the Gilded Age lay secrets that were kept silent even under threat of death? These majestic mansions, filled with the light of crystal chandeliers and the glitter of gold, often became veritable dungeons for their inhabitants. Here, amid lavish balls and exquisite receptions, quiet tragedies unfolded, witnessed only by silent shadows in uniform. Servants saw what was hidden from the eyes of high society: tears on pillows, burned letters, and the cold alienation of spouses. They knew which doors were never to be opened and which conversations were best forgotten forever. Watch the video to the end to find out how one maid's chance discovery could destroy the reputation of an entire dynasty, and what was the true price of a lady's impeccable appearance in that era. What if I told you that everything you believed about the beautiful life of the aristocracy is not true? We are used to seeing calm and spiritual faces of women dressed in silk and velvet in old portraits. But few people think about the fact that behind this calmness often lay a deep and hopeless loneliness. A personal maid was the only person who saw her mistress as she really was, without the mask of a socialite. It was she who combed her mistress's hair in the evenings, heard her heavy sighs, and saw her eyes reddened from tears. Maids in wealthy homes were trained to be invisible, to blend into the interior and not to show that they existed at all. However, this invisibility gave them a unique opportunity to observe the lives of their employers with frightening closeness. They knew the schedule of each family member better than the employers themselves and could predict the master's mood by the sound of his footsteps. It was not difficult for a maid to understand why the mistress refused to come down to dinner today. These women kept secrets that could destroy a tycoon's career or ruin a lucrative marriage. There was an unspoken code. What happened in the boudoir stayed in the boudoir forever. A maid might find a hidden bottle of sedatives or a note that should not be read. At such moments, she had to show remarkable diplomacy, to pretend she hadn't noticed anything. The ability to not see the obvious was sometimes valued more highly than the ability to starch collars perfectly. It was the art of survival in a world where the truth could be too costly. Sometimes this closeness became the only source of human warmth for a lady in a huge cold house. There were cases when the mistress trusted her maid more than her own sister or mother. In moments of despair, social barriers collapsed, and the two women simply sat side by side, united by their shared female destiny. But the next morning, the distance was restored, and cold etiquette reasserted itself. It was a game whose rules were known to both sides and no one dared to break them. We would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about such forced intimacy between people from completely different worlds? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new stories. Are you ready to learn the truth about how the walls of houses themselves helped keep secrets? The mansions of the Gilded Age were designed with particular care to separate the lives of the owners from those who served them. There was a complex system of corridors, back stairs, and hidden doors that guests were unaware of. This invisible part of the house lived by its own rules and rhythms, parallel to the formal life. Servants moved around the house like ghosts, appearing only when they were needed. The famous green baize door served as the boundary between these two worlds, muffling the sounds and smells of the kitchen. Behind this door, work was in full swing. Silver was being cleaned, linen was being ironed, and complex dishes were being prepared. But as soon as a servant crossed the threshold of the formal part of the house, he had to become silent and invisible. Architects designed layouts so that the paths of the owners and servants crossed as rarely as possible. This created the illusion that the house lived and functioned on its own, as if by magic. Some houses had special waiting rooms where footmen could sit for hours at a moment's notice. These rooms were located so that the servant could hear the bell, but not interfere with the master's conversations. It was a limbo space where a person became a function, a waiting mechanism. But it was here, in the silence of waiting, that servants often discussed what they had seen and heard. These rooms became centers of information exchange, a kind of internal telegraph system for the mansion. The system of bells and speaking tubes permeated the entire house, like the nervous system of a huge organism. A board with room numbers hung in the kitchen, and each bell told its own story. Frequent calls from the ladies' boudoir could mean a migraine attack or another nervous breakdown. Silence in the master's study could be a sign of his absence or, conversely, his unwillingness to see anyone. The servants learned to read these signals, understanding the atmosphere in the house by the frequency and insistence of the calls. For a young mistress who had just entered this house, such architecture could become a frightening labyrinth. She could feel lost in the huge halls, where someone from the servants could be hiding behind every door. The feeling of constant, albeit invisible, surveillance created intense psychological pressure. She had to learn to live in the spotlight, keeping up appearances even in her own home. This deprived her of any sense of privacy and security, turning the house into a theatrical stage. But if the walls could hide sounds, could they hide the traces of daily suffering that women inflicted on themselves for the sake of beauty? In the next chapter, you will learn what torments women went through to conform to the ideal. Want to know a secret that will change your life and your perception of the fate of women in the past? The morning toilet of a lady of the Gilded Age was not just a hygienic procedure, but a complex and often painful ritual. It was a time when beauty demanded not just sacrifice, but real physical suffering. The personal maid was not just an assistant, but the executor of this daily torture. It was her hands that tightened the lacing of the corset, transforming the living body into the fashionable hourglass silhouette. The corset was the foundation of everything, a rigid frame in which women were encased from a very young age. The maid knew how to brace her knee or foot correctly to tighten the lacing as much as possible. She saw the red marks and dents left on her mistress's delicate skin after removing this armor. She heard the lady's breath falter as her chest was compressed to unnatural proportions. This process was a daily reminder that a woman's body did not belong to her, but had to conform to a standard. The cosmetics of that time were also far from safe and often contained harmful substances. Lead white, belladonna eye drops to dilate the pupils. All of this slowly poisoned the body. By applying these products, the maid unwittingly became an accomplice in the slow destruction of her mistress's health. She saw how the skin deteriorated and how the eyes dimmed without these artificial stimulants. But it was impossible to refuse cosmetics as society demanded eternal youth and freshness. Getting dressed for an evening ball could take several hours and required the coordinated work of several servants. It was not enough to simply put on a dress. Jewelry, gloves, and a fan also had to be attached. The slightest mistake, crease, or carelessness could become the subject of gossip in high society. The maid was responsible for ensuring that her mistress looked flawless, like a porcelain doll, and no one was to guess how much effort went into this doll-like beauty. Often during these long hours of preparation, conversations arose between women that could not have happened at any other time. The maid saw her mistress vulnerable, half-dressed, stripped of her social armor. In these moments, the lady could complain of fatigue, boredom, or fear of the evening ahead. The maid nodded, adjusted a curl, and handed her smelling salts, knowing that her job was to calm and compose her. She was the mirror that reflected not only her appearance, but also her state of mind. This daily beauty ritual was a kind of cage from which it was impossible to escape. The woman could not dress herself. She was completely dependent on the help of servants. This emphasized her helplessness and status as a beautiful object requiring care. The maid fastening the last button seemed to lock the door on this golden cage. And every morning it all repeated itself, over and over, year after year. We see that behind the glamour of ball gowns lay hard, exhausting work on oneself. Beauty was a duty that women bore with resignation, and servants helped them on this difficult path. Like this if you were moved by the story of the price paid for this idealized picture of the past. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how medicine at that time ruined women's lives? The homes of high society were often filled with a strange silence, broken only by the rustle of dresses and the quiet footsteps of servants. Behind closed bedroom doors, many women suffered for years from ailments that doctors referred to with the vague term hysteria. Maids knew that when their mistress was unwell, it often meant not physical illness, but deep emotional anguish. They brought trays of untouched food and cleaned darkened rooms where time seemed to have stopped. The treatment prescribed by doctors was often worse than the illness itself and amounted to complete isolation. Women were prescribed rest, which meant a ban on reading, writing, creativity, and any mental activity. They were literally locked up within four walls, deprived of their last outlets and connections to the outside world. The servants saw how active and lively personalities faded away in this stifling atmosphere of inaction. They became guardians of this peace, guarding the door behind which their mistress slowly went mad. Maids often became nurses, spending long, sleepless nights at their mistress's bedside. They listened to incoherent monologues full of anxiety and fears that the lady could not confide in anyone else. In this delirium, the truth about an unhappy marriage, longing for unborn children, or lost love often broke through. The servant absorbed this pain, becoming the keeper of the darkest secrets of a woman's soul. But in the morning, he put on his mask of indifference again, serving tea. If the situation got out of control, the woman could be secretly sent to a sanatorium or sent away to a country estate. The servants packed her belongings, knowing that they would most likely never see their mistress in this house again. These disappearances were shrouded in silence, and the name of the missing woman was soon no longer mentioned. For a young and healthy maid, witnessing such a decline was a difficult ordeal. She saw that wealth and status did not protect against inner emptiness and despair. On the contrary, the golden cage often became a catalyst for these conditions, depriving women of purpose and meaning in life. The maid, busy with hard physical labor, sometimes felt more free and alive than her wealthy mistress. This paradoxical truth was revealed only to those who saw life in the mansion from the inside. Medicine at that time was an instrument of control, a way to subdue rebellious or inconvenient women. Diagnoses were made easily, and treatment methods broke the will and personality. Servants were silent witnesses to this process, seeing bright women turn into pale shadows. They knew the price of this peace and this treatment, but had no say in the matter. Physical illness was often just a cry for help from a soul trapped in the grip of social norms. But what happened when these norms dictated the terms of the most important event in a woman's life? In the next chapter, you will learn how marriages were arranged like business deals. Marriages in high society during the Gilded Age were rarely based on love. More often than not, they were a merger of capital and titles. Young girls prepared for this event as if it were the main and only purpose of their existence. From childhood, they were taught that their task was to marry well in order to secure their family's position. Servants watched as young ladies, like thoroughbred horses, were prepared for the Vanity Fair, their first ball season. It was a cynical market where beauty, youth, and dowry were commodities with a price tag. Preparing for a wedding in a wealthy household was like preparing for a military campaign or a large-scale theatrical premiere. Tailors, jewelers, and dressmakers besieged the mansion, creating a dowry worthy of a princess. Servants spent days unpacking boxes of lace, lingerie, and dresses, arranging them in chests. But amid all this hustle and bustle, they often noticed not the bride's joy, but her fear and confusion. The girl might not even know her future husband well, having only seen him at official receptions. It was not uncommon for a girl's heart to belong to another, but social inequality made such a union impossible. Maids could find hidden photographs or dried flowers, reminders of true love. Sometimes they helped deliver farewell letters, becoming accomplices in a little secret. These silent testimonies of a broken heart were kept in the farthest drawers of dressers, away from the husband's eyes. It was a secret pain that a woman carried throughout her life. Mothers who had gone through similar marriages often put harsh pressure on their daughters, forcing them to accept their fate. They convinced them that endure and you will love, that social status was more important than romantic nonsense. Servants heard these conversations, full of cold worldly wisdom and bitterness. The circle was complete. Victims became overseers, sending their daughters into the same golden cages. It was a system that reproduced itself, grinding down destinies. Pregnancy and the birth of an heir were the next obligations that had to be fulfilled. If this did not happen, the woman felt enormous pressure and condemnation. Servants saw her tears after visits from doctors and the whispers of relatives behind her back. Infertility, or the birth of only daughters, could turn a woman's life into hell. She felt like a defective product that had failed to fulfill its main function. Thus, behind the luxurious facades and famous names lay destinies broken in the pursuit of ambition and money. The servants knew that the happy smiles in wedding photos were often just a tribute to etiquette. They saw how a successful marriage turned into years of loneliness together. And in their eyes, one could read silent sympathy for those whom society considered the chosen ones of fate. What if I told you that the family's most terrible secrets disappeared in the fireplaces? It was the servants' duty to clean the fireplaces, and it was there that they often found traces of what their masters wanted to erase from memory forever. Half-burned letters, torn documents, photographs, all of this fell into the hands of maids and footmen. The ashes could tell the story of a secret romance, financial fraud, or family disgrace. A smart servant knew that what lay in the fireplace was not meant for prying eyes and had to be destroyed completely. Sometimes the destruction of evidence was a direct order. Burn this immediately and forget what you saw. The mistress's trembling hands held out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, and the maid threw them into the fire. She saw the flames greedily devouring the lines written in familiar or unfamiliar handwriting. In those moments, she became not just a servant, but an accomplice, a keeper of secrets. This act of burning was a kind of cleansing ritual, an attempt to start with a clean slate. In the men's offices, fireplaces consumed other secrets: card debts, letters from mistresses, threats from competitors. The valet who cared for his master knew more about his double life than his lawful wife. He saw bills from jewelry stores that never reached his wife. He knew the addresses where flowers and gifts were delivered, and he too remained silent, burning compromising papers until they turned to gray ash. Sometimes ashes were all that remained of high hopes and shattered dreams. Burned invitations to balls to which they were never invited, or drafts of letters that were never sent. The fireplace was a silent confidant, absorbing all the pain and disappointment of the inhabitants of the house. And the servant cleaning the firebox was the only witness to this silent dialogue with the fire. This ash in the fireplace is a powerful metaphor for life in that era. Outwardly clean and beautiful, but inside, burnt feelings. The servants, carrying out buckets of ashes, carried out the very essence of the house's hidden life. They knew that the cleanliness of the living room was bought at the price of dirt hidden from prying eyes. And in this dirt, mixed with ashes, was the whole truth about the glittering era. I discovered this by accident while studying the memoirs of maids of that time, and it struck me to the core. What do you think? Do servants have the right to keep such secrets, or should they have told the truth? In the next chapter, you will learn how the walls of the house turned into a real prison. Despite the constant presence of servants and frequent receptions, the life of a wealthy woman was marked by profound isolation. She was always in the public eye, yet remained infinitely lonely. Etiquette forbade her from communicating sincerely with her peers, and friendship with the lower classes was impossible. The maid saw her mistress sitting for hours at the window, looking out at the street where real life was bustling. It was a special kind of isolation. Isolation within a crowd, within her own home. The lady's social circle was strictly regulated and limited to people of her own class. Visits were a formality, an exchange of pleasantries where one could not say a word too many. One could not complain about one's husband, admit to being tired, or discuss anything really important. All conversations revolved around fashion, the weather, and social news, remaining superficial and empty. The servants serving tea saw these frozen smiles and heard these meaningless phrases. Even relationships with one's own children were often distant and formal. The children were raised by nannies and governesses, and their mother only saw them at certain times. The maid watched as the mother felt lost in the presence of her own children, not knowing what to talk to them about. This alienation was a tragedy for both sides, but such were the rules of upbringing. Motherhood was reduced to a pretty picture, rather than a living connection. The ban on professional activities or serious hobbies deprived women of the opportunity for self-realization. All that remained for them was the role of living room decoration, party organizer, and philanthropist. But even charity was strictly regulated and often ostentatious. The servants saw how boredom ate away at their mistress's soul, pushing her to strange actions or whims. It was the anguish of a person who had everything except the right to be herself. Isolation in a gilded cage was worse than poverty because there was no legitimate way out. Escape meant social death and shame for the whole family. All a woman could do was endure, hiding her pain behind a polite smile, and the servants were the only spectators of this endless drama of loneliness. The housekeeper occupied a special place in the hierarchy of servants. She was the woman who held all the strings of the household in her hands. She was not just the senior servant, but the real eminence grise of the mansion. She always wore a bunch of keys on her belt that opened all the pantries, cupboards, and, metaphorically, all the secrets of the house. The housekeeper knew more about the habits and weaknesses of the owners than anyone else. She was a buffer between the masters and the rest of the servants, filtering information in both directions. It was the housekeeper who decided which problems should be brought to the attention of the mistress and which should be dealt with independently. She could conceal petty theft committed by a maid or, conversely, dismiss her without explanation. She had the power to punish and pardon, creating the atmosphere in the lower part of the house. For a young and inexperienced mistress, the housekeeper often became a mentor and even a frightening authority figure. The lady depended on her as she did not know how to manage such a huge household. She knew the skeletons in every closet, literally and figuratively. She knew where the alcoholic master's booze was hidden or where the old letters from the late grandmother were kept. This knowledge made her both irreplaceable and dangerous. It was difficult to dismiss the old housekeeper because she would take too much information with her. Therefore, they often grew old in the house, becoming living symbols of its history. The relationship between the mistress and the housekeeper could be complicated, from complete trust to Cold War. The struggle for power in the house was conducted quietly, with glances, hints, and orders. But at critical moments, they united to protect the house from external threats. It was an alliance forged by the need to survive in a harsh social world. The figure of the housekeeper with keys on her belt is a symbol of control and order, concealing the chaos of human passions. She locked the doors not only to prevent the silver from being stolen, but also to keep the demons of the family from escaping. She was the guardian of the threshold, protecting the peace of those who paid her salary. And often she took these secrets with her to the grave. Husband and wife in a wealthy home often lived separate lives, meeting only at the dinner table. Each had their own apartments, their own servants, their own daily routine, and their own secrets. The master's valet and the mistress's maid knew better than anyone about this gulf between the spouses. They saw how rarely the door connecting the spouses' bedrooms was opened. This door was often locked, becoming a symbol of emotional separation. The man lived an active social life: clubs, business, politics, hunting, travel. His home was a place of rest and representation for him, but not the center of his world. The woman, on the other hand, was locked in this house, her world shrinking to the size of the living room and boudoir. The servants saw this contrast, the dynamic life of one and the static existence of the other. They understood the injustice of this arrangement, but accepted it as a given. Children in such families often grew up observing this model of cold relationships. They saw their parents living like neighbors, polite but strangers to each other. Nannies and governesses replaced parental warmth, becoming the closest people to them. The tragedy of lovelessness was passed down from generation to generation, and the servants were the chroniclers of this family chronicle of alienation. Sometimes in old age, when passions subsided, spouses could become closer, united by shared memories and losses. But often they remained two lonely souls living under the same roof of a huge house. The servants cared for two old people who never became close. It was a sad picture of the end of a life spent observing propriety. The story of two lives under one roof is a story of how social norms killed living feelings. Wealth did not bring people together, but divided them, erecting walls of gold and etiquette between them. The servants saw this emptiness and perhaps rejoiced in their simple but more honest lives. By the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the world was changing rapidly, and the old order was cracking at the seams. The advent of electricity, telephones, and automobiles changed the lives of even the most conservative households. Servants were the first to master new technologies, becoming conduits of progress within ancient walls. But for aging mistresses, these changes were often frightening and incomprehensible. They felt their time slipping away, their familiar world of rituals and traditions crumbling. The younger generation of servants no longer wanted to put up with their lack of rights and the strict hierarchy. They read newspapers, discussed workers' rights, and dreamed of a different life. The old servants, loyal dogs of the aristocracy, looked on in horror at this audacity. The generational conflict in the kitchen reflected global social shifts in society. The mistresses felt that they were losing control over their staff, that fear and respect were becoming a thing of the past. The passing of this era was a beautiful but sad sight, full of nostalgia. Mansions were turned into museums or apartment buildings. Secrets were forgotten. Letters were burned. But the stories of these women, mistresses and maids, remained within the walls, in the creaking floorboards and in old photographs. It was a farewell to a world where beauty was more important than comfort, and honor was more precious than happiness. The servants, who knew which doors not to open, took the keys to those doors with them. But we can try to look through the keyhole of history and see their shadows. This is a lesson that nothing lasts forever, and even the most unshakable rules crumble to dust. The end of an era was the beginning of freedom, but also the end of a great mystery. We peered behind the thick velvet curtains of the Gilded Age and saw what was hidden behind the impeccable facade. It was a world where wealth often meant not freedom, but a golden cage with a strict schedule and set of rules. The women who lived in these palaces paid a high price for their status, the price of their happiness, health, and right to be themselves. And the servants, those silent witnesses, kept their secrets, becoming unwitting participants in their dramas. History shows us that behind every great house there is a human story full of pain and hope. Do you think this luxurious life was worth the sacrifices made by the women of that era? Or is a simple but free life always better than a golden cage? Share your opinion in the comments. It is very important for us to know what you think. And of course, subscribe to our channel to discover new pages of history with us.